Good evening and welcome, everyone. We are meeting here under the auspices of the Center for International Conflict, Resolution, whose director is sitting here in the first row, Alvaro Chivico, for the fifth in a series of public interviews with distinguished international players in the field of mediation and negotiation. Our guest today, my guest today is Sir Brian Urquhart. Now, Sir Brian Urquhart was the first recruit of the second.
Yeah.
Well, you clarify that. who worked very closely, firstly, with the executive secretary of the commission that eventually led to the setting up of the United Nations as such, and then worked very closely with the five first secretaries general. Now, he is the author of three wonderful books. One is a biography of Dag Hammarskjöld. Another is a biography of Ralph Bunche, the United Nations first Nobel Peace Prize laureate, and finally a memoir, A Life in Peace and War. And those of you who are students of the Second World War will be interested to learn that had Sir Brian's advice been followed, Operation Market Garden would perhaps have been a success, or at least not a debacle. You may want to tell us a bit about that. You would have to be a bit of a student, because in the film that was made of that particular episode, A Bridge Too Far, for some odd reason, the character who played Sir Brian was given another surname. And that is something that perhaps you want to...
Sean Connery's ego was the trouble.
I see, yes.
He was also called Urquhart in the book.
Yes, you can't have two Urquharts, that would confuse. Now, Sir Brian's name is probably most frequently associated with peacekeeping, which was one of the innovations, one of the creations of the United Nations from the very beginning. And I was just rereading Brian's biography of Ralph Bunche, where he reveals that some of the key principles associated with peacekeeping were in fact executive decisions taken by Ralph Bunche himself in setting up the original, the first peacekeeping or the first peace observation operations. I'd like you, Brian, perhaps just to start, perhaps to reflect a bit in retrospect about how you see the original conception of the United Nations as compared to what it became.
Yes. Well, I think that the important thing, if you're looking at the beginning of the United Nations, is to realize that in fact originally it was a military organization. It was founded in January the 1st, 1942, with the declaration of the United Nations in Washington of 26 countries who were at that point fighting the war. And I suppose it was perfectly natural, therefore, that everybody would assume that the alliance which won the war would stick together to look after the peace. There was never a more foolish assumption, but that's what they thought. And of course, the original form of the UN was a great power alliance wrapped up in an international organization. And we were, actually, I mean, I can never, it shows how simple-minded people are, because everybody were throwing their hats in the air about this at the beginning, just after the war ended, saying that wonderful, you know, our chums, the Russians, and so on, with us, and so on. The only people who didn't think it was wonderful, I have to say, was the Soviet Union. They were very sour right from the beginning, and I think they were right. They didn't think that they were not in a jovial mood at all, not least because they had suffered huge casualties in the war and were economically completely devastated. And therefore, they were extremely nervous of the United States. They also did not have a nuclear weapon, and they were extremely nervous of the United States. Anyhow, it didn't last. I mean, after about a year, the first person, I think, who really got it right about the organization of the UN and the 5 permanent members of the Security Council and the veto was Ernie Bevin, who was the amazing Foreign Secretary of Great Britain during the war. Ernie Bevin was a union man, and he said, whenever I see the Russians, it reminds me of the plumbers' strike in Bristol in 1903. Of course, none of us could understand what on earth that meant, but it was pretty bad, the plumbers' strike in Bristol in 1903. But inside this old trades unionist, there was a tremendous dislike of communism, and he didn't feel that these were good union men, these Soviet people he was dealing with. And of course, he was perfectly right, they weren't. And that swept like a sort of disease through the UN after about a year. I mean, everybody had been very much sort of energized to think how wonderful the UN was. President Roosevelt had sent Adlai Stevenson and now that poet, his name escapes me, a famous American poet, well, it'll come back in a minute, around the United States for a whole year before the San Francisco conference to tell the American people that the Charter of the United Nations was a good thing, and it was something that they needed just as much as everybody else did. I think they were much too successful, because I remember when we first got to the United States in March 1946, people were amazed at how hostile the Security Council was and what terrible things people said about each other. It was a huge letdown. I don't really know that it's, of course the other thing about the UN was it was set up to deal with, as great organizations usually are, to deal with the situation before. It was to deal with what had happened in the interwar period between 1919 and 1939, which was a period of aggression, a period of acute economic depression, which had led in a number of countries to a takeover by the Nazis or the fascists or a military regime. And particularly aggression was actually not something which was really about to happen after the war. You had a much more complicated situation. You had two ideological empires really at loggerheads with each other, and sometimes looking as if they were going to fight. And of course, nobody had also foreseen, curiously enough, the third main thing the UN was set up to do, which was to do something about empires. I've just been reviewing a book, I think by one of your colleagues here, Professor Mazawa, called The No Enchanted Palace. And it's very, very interesting on the role that the empires, and particularly the British Empire, played in the setting up both of the League of Nations and of the United Nations. And until quite late on, I think that a lot of people thought that in some inscrutable way the UN was going to be more or less based on the British and to a lesser extent the French empires, and this somehow was going to be a basis for carrying on. Well, actually, it turned out very soon this was a complete non-starter. In fact, one of the great surprises in the history of the UN is the speed with which decolonization took place. I mean, people were talking about 100 or 150 years in 1945, and the whole process of decolonization was effectively over in about 20 years, which again has completely altered not only the size and the direction of the organization, but also the kind of things it needs to do. I go on forever, so that you better blow a whistle, I think.
Well, you've already, you're just, I don't want to cut you off just as you're beginning to address the question that I
One of the things about being old is that have no idea how long we've been talking for. Watch out for it.
Well, in this case, it's absolutely wonderful. But now, of course, because of the onset of the Cold War, I mean, there was a certain disappointment. Well, a certain disappointment is putting it rather mildly. It was a major disappointment. The United Nations didn't quite stand up to what was expected of it. But of course, the Cold War was around for a long time, a good, about 4 decades, approximately. And that rather tied the hands of Secretaries General, didn't it?
Yes, it did, and it also made them much more important, curiously enough. I mean...
Tell us how.
Well, I think that anybody in the Secretariat who had time to think about anything and was capable of doing so realized after about 10 months that something was seriously wrong. And after all, we had the first Secretary General, Trygve Lie of Norway, was more or less excommunicated by the Soviet Union because he vigorously backed the Security Council decision to go into Korea to fight the North Korea when it invaded the South. And so you had a very, I mean, there's no good pretending that this was the love feast that everybody had been thinking about in San Francisco. It just wasn't. I think the next Secretary General, Dag Hammarskjöld, well, we'll come to that in a minute, but the delightful thing about Dag Hammarskjöld was that he was selected by the permanent members of the Security Council in the belief that he was an extremely dull Swedish civil servant. And of course he turned out to be something rather the opposite of that. He was a ball of fire. And he very much realized that there was something to be done in the Cold War, in the UN, and possibly the Secretary General was one of the very few people who could do it, because he, in theory, at any rate, had been elected both by the Russians and the Americans. I mean, they both approved of his Secretary Generalship, largely, as I said, because they didn't know anything about him, which was excellent. And he really, in the political field, I think, was looking for an opportunity to show that if you got into a dangerous situation in the Cold War, and particularly if you got into a situation where the Chinese were involved, though they were not at that point, they weren't representing China in the UN, they had not yet got the Chinese seat, then the Secretary General possibly was about the only person who would talk to all of them and try to get away from it. And by sheer chance, he had a very good opportunity to prove that, because when he became Secretary General in, let's see, 1953. What?
53?
51, 52, or 52, 53, I can't remember. It was the aftermath of the Korean War, and there were 4 American fighter pilots and a B-29 crew who had come, all of whom had come down, had parachuted in China. For one reason or another, they had run out of gas or something. And the Chinese the courts had condemned them as spies. I don't think it was altogether surprising that they condemned the B-29 crew, because the aircraft was absolutely full of intelligence gadgets of one sort or another, and about a ton of leaflets as well. So it was rather hard to say these were honest bomber pilots, really. They were something a bit more than that. But this was a major crisis, because it was in the days of John Foster Dulles, and the United States was not speaking to the Chinese, and nothing on God's earth would persuade them to speak to them. And so they brought the case to the Security Council. To the General Assembly first. And the General Assembly sort of waved its hands in the air and said, no, it's very difficult, it's a bad situation. And then it ended up with the usual sentence, request the Secretary General to take this matter under advisement or something like that. And then it went to the Security Council, and by that time people were jumping up and down in Washington and suggesting nuclear strikes on the Chinese mainland and that kind of thing. And it really was extremely dangerous. And the Security Council referred the matter again to the Secretary General, and greatly to everybody's surprise, Hammarskjöld announced he was leaving for China the next day. Well, that shook up the permanent members, I must say. And Dulles was quite upset about this. He said, we're going to talk to these people. And Hammarskjöld said, well, you know, if you're going to try to get anything out of people, it's really best to be able to talk to them. It doesn't really matter whether they're enemies or friends. You have to do that. This was not a point of view that was well received, I can tell you. And the Russians were extremely upset because they didn't think the Secretary General ought to be doing this kind of thing. But they did, on the other hand, they did not want to have a huge mess involving the People's Republic of China and the United States, which was what was evidently on the cards. Hammarskjöld, who really loved this kind of thing and was very good at it, had sort of rehearsals of what he was going to do in Beijing. And then the Chinese said, are you coming as a representative of the Security Council? Because they keep condemning us, we won't have that. And he said, oh, no, I'm coming under a rather particular formula. It was a particular formula afoot, it didn't exist. He had worked out this idea that in certain circumstances, when the things were dangerous enough, the Secretary General had an obligation to try to do something about it. Not in any ordinary run-of-the-mill confrontations, but in a real world-class crisis. And this certainly was that. And Zhou Enlai was delighted with that. Both he and Hammarskjöld very much like very, very long sort of historico-philosophical discussions of one side and another, which is why the talk took so long. But that was fine. And he did eventually, in a period of 6 months, he got the fighter pilots out first because there wasn't any question about them. And then there was the problem with the B-29 crew that it had 2 civilian members who were in the CIA, it was then discovered, who he couldn't deal with because they were, I mean, there was every reason to put them in jail if you were Chinese, they were agents. But the crew itself, which was, I think, 13 people, it was very difficult because the Chinese had to overturn a legal decision of their own courts, and they didn't want to do that. And then we noticed in our office that we kept getting inquiries from the Chinese ambassador in Stockholm about Hammarskjöld's birthday. And then it turned out it was going to be his 50th birthday on July the 29th. And they were beaming when they heard that. And sure enough, Hammarskjöld was in a very, very obscure fishing village in southern Sweden, which didn't have a post office or a telephone. Very helpful. And a telegram arrived at this place saying that the Chinese government thought that he'd like to know that the bomber crew was on its way by train to Kowloon and was going to Hong Kong. And then it said, of course, they violated Chinese sovereignty with the worst possible intentions, but nonetheless. And then it said the government of the People's Republic of China wish to express their appreciation and congratulations to Mr. Hammarskjöld on his 50th birthday. And then I think they also, in some side note, said, you better not try to explain this in Washington because they won't get it. But this is what we had to do. There wasn't any way we could. Well, this put Hammarskjöld on the map as someone who could be trusted to take on extremely difficult situations and not make a mess of it. And of course, his whole effort, particularly with peacekeeping, was to try to turn situations round which might lead to an open confrontation between the East and the West, and particularly between the Soviet Union and the United States. This was the object after the Suez crisis, when there were very ominous noises coming out of Moscow about what they were going to do with the British and French if they didn't get out of Egypt. And in the Congo later on, it was the same thing, and in a number of situations. And I think Hammarskjöld's great feeling was that, of course, the UN couldn't do what it was supposed to do, which was to deal with aggressors. First of all, because there weren't any conventional aggressors, except possibly the great powers. And in the second place, if you didn't have the 5 permanent members on board, you didn't have any forces, because the original plan was that the permanent members would mobilize almost on a wartime scale to back up a UN decision, as they did in Korea when the Soviet Union went there to stop it. But I think if you look at Hammarskjöld's, he really did have a very kind of philosophical mind, which sort of saw in stages quite far ahead, and he didn't want to rush things. For example, after we put the first peacekeeping force, not what Alvaro was talking about, the observer group in Palestine and Kashmir in 1948, but in 1956 we improvised this peacekeeping force. That had not been done before. And John Foster Dulles, who was actually by this point dying of cancer, but he was still Secretary of State, was absolutely over the moon about the peacekeeping force. He thought it was absolutely, UNF-1, he thought it was wonderful, and he contrived to get both houses of Congress to adopt a resolution urging a standing peacekeeping force. Well, how much things have changed someday, but anyhow, it was quite interesting. Nobody except me ever seems to have heard of it, but it's true. He also wrote a letter to Hammarskjöld saying it was very, very important to have this standing peacekeeping force and get it going and having it there so that we can go whizzing into wherever it was. Hammarskjöld was extremely reluctant about this. He said, it's very dangerous. You can't do this. In the first place, how do you know that the next situation is going to be suitable for that? How do you know which governments are going to be acceptable and which are not in the next situation? Who's going to pay for it? How are you going to stop it from suddenly being injected into a real war which hasn't stopped, in which peacekeepers are useless because they're not allowed to use force, and indeed aren't in sufficient numbers to do so? And so he thought you had to deal with this. This was a major unscripted event in UN history, and you had to go very easy with it. Well, it's interesting, really, how it's caught on, I must say, isn't it? How many people they have now in the field? 100?
Well over 100,000.
Yes.
Well over 100,000.
Now, I must stop talking because this is terrible.
So, these matters, or all these questions that you've just referred to, were essentially not resolved when the first peacekeeping operation proper began in 1956. It just began it, and there was no sort of a doctrine or general principle.
Well, it had to be worked out. It was on the hoof, really. I mean, it had to be worked out, which was pretty tricky because, I mean, for example, we didn't have time. I hate to say this because it's boasting, but we got the first peacekeeping force into the operational area in 10 days. I'm told now it takes 6 months, but it's quite, I don't know why this was, but anyhow, there it was. But we didn't have time to brief them, and one unit, they were in Gaza, and the day was ending, and the muezzin began the evening prayer from, there were real muezzins in those days in the top of the
minarets, yes.
And one of the units thought this was a guy calling for civil disobedience and violence, so they fired a number of warning shots at the unfortunate priest. And it was only after quite a bit of time that somebody said, no, hey, wait, whoa, whoa, whoa. And actually, you used to be able to see where the warning shots were. I don't know if you still can. This is the kind of thing that is difficult when you put people of different religions and cultures in the same rather combustible place without having time to brief them. And of course, there was a great deal. I mean, running that first, it sounds like a great success now, but first of all, you would have the New York Times saying that Hammarskjöld had given in to NASA because NASA had sent a lieutenant governor to Gaza. It was, in fact, legally Egyptian territory. And then the Arabs would say this is colonization by force, and you have huge demonstrations saying United Nations, remember Abu Qir. Now, why would we have remembered Abu Qir? Which I think was a battle with the French. Well, never mind. But I'm just saying that it wasn't exactly a sort of bunch of roses, the whole thing. It was very, very difficult. It was managed with great skill by Hammarskjöld and Bunch. It was an absolutely 24-hour-a-day work to keep the thing on track. And that's why the response to Dulles' suggestion, which is, I think, almost the last thing he did before he died, was extremely low-key, because we didn't think that, and I think that was right. You can't replicate a success in a series of absolutely unforeseeable circumstances without getting into a terrible muddle.
Tell me, Brian, the first major setback in peacekeeping was Congo, was it not?
No, the first, oh, wait a minute. Yes, no, wait a minute. Yes, it was, of course. It was the Congo. Well, now I'm amazed at the Congo. I don't know if any of you are studying the Congo either. It's
if you want to compare the two for us,
appalling
the
form,
two excursions.
or in 1960. I mean, that was another thing. Hammarskjöld had become obsessed with the problems of about to become independent Africa. He'd done a tour of virtually every colony and territory in Africa in early 1960. It took about 5 weeks. And he'd come away with the notion that there were some absolutely remarkable young Africans waiting to take over, but they had had no experience whatsoever of running a state, and that this was going to be extremely difficult for them, not least because the colonial boundaries don't have any real reason except lines of longitude and latitude. I mean, they cut across tribal boundaries and economic zones and so on in a completely irrational way. He had been particularly upset when he went to the Congo, because he discovered that there were no officers, no Congolese officers in the Armée Nationale Congolaise, the Congolese army, which was very large. There were 17 university graduates in the whole country, all in some rather fancy part of the humane arts, and not much use to you in trying to govern a country. And that none of them had had any real experience at all. I mean, and this went for the police, the army, the civil service, the bank, everything. And he put Ralph Bunch, the person he trusted most, out there to wait for the independence and just see if we couldn't avoid a frightful mess up on the very first day. Well, that didn't that the independence didn't go too well, partly because the King of the Belgians made a terrific speech saying how wonderful the Belgian rule had been, which didn't really sit very well with the audience. And Patrice Lumumba, who was the untried prime minister, really suddenly showed what he was capable of. He made a blistering speech in reply to the King of the Belgians, which is something that the Congolese had never managed to do before. And it was an absolute, it really was an amazing turning point. That led to a real movement. The Belgians thought everything was going to be the same after independence as it had been before. In fact, they wrote on the blackboards in the rooms of the Congolese National Army, they wrote, "Before independence equals after independence," meaning, okay, chaps, we'll have the ceremony and that's it. Everything will be exactly the same. And the Congolese suddenly, finding they had a very, very fiery leader, decided it was not going to be the same. So you've got a clash. Well, the army mutinied. The Belgian officers mostly left. And then the Belgian civil service began to leave in droves. So by the time we got there 2 weeks later, it was like the Marie Celeste. I mean, you're there where the police headquarters was empty. The post offices were all empty. The telephones weren't manned. There was nobody in the control tower at the airport. There were no doctors in the hospitals. So there were quite a lot of enthusiastic Congolese nurses attempting to learn on the job how to do appendectomies and things like that, but it led to a considerable amount of panic. And it was a complete meltdown. It was really strange. But I won't get onto that for the time being. But now everybody says, "Oh, what a terrific time that was! You know, that was a serious." We were thought to have made a complete failure of it at the time, and everyone was saying, "You know, they should never have got in there. It's a terrible mess. They've got a lot of people killed, and so on." I think it would have actually, funnily enough, I think it could have been. There was just a chance for the Congolese that they might have got a working government. They had Cyril Adula, who was a very good prime minister, serious, good person. They had an enormous kind of assistance operation, mostly civilian UN, who had been told that on no account were they to take over the jobs. They were to train Congolese on the job and leave as soon as they could do it. It was not a bad affair, but it broke up, of course, on east-west lines, which left what made it really impossible. I mean, in one afternoon, the prime minister sacked the president, and the president sacked the prime minister, and then the Russians declared for the prime minister, and the Americans declared for the president. This doesn't lead to a happy country at all. And it was a complete mess. And we were left for 3 years. You couldn't get any decisions at all out of the Security Council because whatever was put up was vetoed by somebody. And yet, if you didn't do anything, everybody was furious, said, what the hell do you think you're all doing in the Congo? So Hammarskjöld took the courageous line that since nobody else could make any decisions, he would. And every decision or every failure to take a decision produced a sort of a nightmare row from somewhere. This was and then of course on top of all that, they managed to murder Lumumba, the prime minister. Personally, having spent a rather regrettable number of hours with him, it was extremely difficult. I think that he was the Congo's only hope, curiously enough, because he was the one politician in this huge country. I mean, it's much bigger than Western Europe. He was the one politician who believed that we must now have a unified Congo. I think there were 82 fairly large tribal kind of agglomerations that made up the Congo, and it wasn't really governable as a unified state, but Lumumba thought it ought to be. And if he could have just been tamed so that he didn't change his mind every 3 minutes and didn't make all these terrible threats, which always evaporated. I mean, we were constantly being told that we were going to be run out with blood and the sword. I hadn't heard this used since I was a child, I must say. I was quite impressed by this. It didn't sound good. But then it always stopped. I mean, and then by the end of the conversation, he'd be back to saying, well, you know, you're the only friends I've got, and so on. But he really had an idea about that country, and if it had only somehow managed to mature, we wouldn't be looking at the absolutely appalling situation there is there now.
And a lot of it is attributable to,
what?
A lot of it, the current
really
situation
went wrong
is
then.
attributable.
It went wrong because you had 3 secessionist states which weakened the central government, and then on top of that they put in a kleptomaniac as the president, which I'm sorry to say was the CIA's idea, though they now deny it. But I mean, when we tried to point out that Mobutu, though ostensibly a nice and amiable chap, in fact, if anything, wasn't actually nailed down, he took it. And this is not necessarily what you want in a country which is overflowing with extremely valuable minerals. But I think very often, out of irritation, and also lack of sleep, because Lumumba had his best ideas about 3 a.m. and he was on the blower right away. And after about 7 nights of this, you really felt that somehow this couldn't go on. But I think that you need to have a serious idea about a country's future after a great disaster. And I think he was one of the very few who had one, and more's the pity that somehow it couldn't have been used because it should have been.
We could go on the entire evening and more on the Congo, but I do want to get you to talk a bit about the crisis in '67 in UNEF. The withdrawal of UNEF, which the United Nations is frequently criticized for doing it at the behest of Nasser.
Well, you know, this was one of those great situations where sometimes I wonder if you can really run the United Nations as an intergovernmental organization at all, because everybody behaved extremely badly. What had happened was after almost 10 years of the UNEF-1, the original peacekeeping force, which, as I said before, was a success.
between Israel and Egypt.
Everybody had got used to the idea that UNIF absolutely worked beautifully, and the Arabs had got furious with Nasser, and everybody, the King of Jordan and the President of Syria and everybody else, were saying, there's that goddamn Nasser, he thinks he's the head Arab, and there he's hiding behind the blue helmets, and this won't do, and so on. And Nasser apparently was quite affected by this. And he decided, he just got a whole lot of, a whole armory of, I think, was it Russian or Czech weapons? I think it was Russian. And he was very proud of these things, though nobody was quite sure how to work them. And so he he sent this completely sort of unintelligible message, which apparently should have been something different, to the commander of UNEF, saying, asking him to remove the UNEF troops from the borders and from Sharm el-Sheikh. Sharm el-Sheikh, which is now like Las Vegas, in that time was completely uninhabited except for 2 or 3 huts. And it had 30 Swedes counting the ships that went through the Straits of...
Tehran?
Yes. What? My memory for names is gone, but no mind. There's a quite narrow strait which goes for its shipping, goes up to Elath, at the Israeli port. And they didn't do anything. They had a thing that was supposed to convert seawater into fresh water, but it actually didn't work very well, so they were sick as dogs most of the time. But it really didn't matter. The whole point was they were there. And Nasser had certainly understood that, and he ordered them out, surrounded them. We then had 1,200 troops on a 300-mile frontier border, lightly armed, not allowed to use their weapons except in the last resort in self-defense. And incidentally, if they'd got into a fight, their governments would certainly have withdrawn them instantly. But people in Europe, that very excitable foreign minister, what the hell is he called, of England? George Brown, who Private Eye said was tired and emotional, which was the Private Eye phrase for drunk. Tired and emotional George Brown, for example, was jumping up and down. He seemed to think that UNEF 1 was like NATO. He never, and it was, I tried to explain it, we all tried to explain it, it's hopeless, he couldn't get it. He said, you people are fading away before the Egyptian dictator. He said, well, in the first place, we're there at the permission of the Egyptian dictator. Sinai has been Egyptian for something like 4,000 or 5,000 years. I mean, it's not exactly a new arrangement. And in the UN, we respect national sovereignty. And the arrangement that Nasser made with Dag Hammarskjöld in 1956 was that UNEF would stay until its job was done, and it would leave if requested by the Egyptian government after that. Well, its job was done. It had been done in about 6 months. Oh, no, they said, Joe, just turning tail, flying, and Abba Eban, never wanted to lose an opportunity for a neat phrase, said it was like someone who took down the umbrella the moment it started to rain, and then there was a lot of this stuff. And the New York Times had an editorial saying that Uthant had the courage of a wet noodle, I remember. That was very helpful. It was absolutely impossible to get any of these people to understand the nature of UNEF's presence. And the fact that the Israelis had refused to have UNEF in Israel as a matter of sovereign right. Nobody had argued with it. Now, Egypt, which had had them there for 10 years, wasn't being allowed that sovereign right nonsense. It was natural. And so everybody's behaving in a kind of late colonial way. It was extraordinary. Even the Canadians, I couldn't believe it. The Canadians sent a rather small battleship to the eastern Mediterranean in case of trouble. Well, you can imagine what that did in Cairo. Nasser immediately ordered the Canadian troops in UNEF to leave immediately because he wouldn't be responsible for their safety. And they were taken out literally overnight. since they were doing all the logistics and all the air stuff, it was rather unfortunate. But there it was. It was, I must say, I've never been quite so irritated, both by governments and the press at that. I mean, it was simply, everybody was rattling off this, they'd never bothered to look and see what this arrangement was. We had a plan, when I say we, I mean Bunch and I suppose the Secretary General, that it would take us a very long time to remove UNEF. And the words were 3 Ds. Anyhow, they should be moved in a dignified, dependable, and sound way. And this was fairly remote in those days. This would have taken 3 or 4 months. Of course, it was completely snookered because the Israelis, who I think you have to admire it, they saw an opportunity of a lifetime. They saw a perfectly good reason to go into Sinai and take it, and also to take Sharm el-Sheikh, which had an Egyptian coastal battery just behind it, which could shell the shipping into Eilat. And sure enough, everybody dithered around. The only person who tried to change Nasser's mind was Uthant, who went to Cairo. Nobody, I don't think any senior American person or senior Brit or anyone actually tried. They didn't want to get into it because Nasser was notoriously difficult to deal with. Nasser had made this great proclamation and was also trying to show the Arabs he was with them. And so that was why he did the invasion. And once he'd done it, he couldn't possibly go back. I think this supposedly set back peacekeeping quite a long way. But then, of course, it didn't, because the next crisis we had, everybody wanted a peacekeeping force, so that it really, I mean, it was obviously, that actually had a major effect. I was particularly sort of enraged by the way that Uthant and Bunch had been treated. Their health both began to decline. The health of both men began to decline after that, though they put a very good public face on it, and laboriously and patiently tried to explain what the reality of the thing was. But there it is. It was I don't think it really set back the idea very much. I think what has set back the idea, actually, of peacekeeping is that over the years, the conflicts tended to be inside the borders of one country, with a lot of jokers masquerading as, I don't know, what are they called, warlords and things like that, who we don't have any kind of, we had no rules about how to deal with them. I mean, the Congo was the first of these. Nobody had the slightest idea how complicated that was going to be, particularly when it became a Cold War proxy battlefield, which is what it became.
But the UN personnel talked to the warlords, of course.
What?
The UN personnel on the ground spoke to the warlords as necessary.
Absolutely, we talk to anybody if necessary. That's another thing I've never been able to understand. I mean, it's like poor Dulles and the prisoners in China. Did he really suppose that you couldn't possibly proceed talking to these chaps when we had a possibility of a world war on hand? I don't know. I mean, it's very odd. And it's also happened, of course, it happened on a number of other occasions with the Chinese, with the Viet Cong, with the Palestinians for a very long time. I think that I wish to. The tricky British had exactly the opposite view. When they were an imperial power, they would talk to anybody. And in fact, if they found they couldn't defeat them, they would turn the whole thing into a social event and bring jeweled gifts from Queen Victoria and that kind of thing, and have tea. And it worked surprisingly well. I don't think it would work now, but at least their minds weren't closed to talking to all these fellows. I've never been able to understand the other approach, I must say. It doesn't make any sense, because nobody has any doubt that the United States is easily the most powerful country in the world, and was even more powerful then, so that you're not going to actually get everybody to think you're some kind of sissy by refusing to talk to the enemy. I don't know.
Brian, one of the areas where things have evolved is the area of sovereignty, where Kofi Annan has went on record as saying that sovereignty, in any case, isn't quite what it used to be.
Except in the UN.
Except
It's the temple of sovereignty, yes, absolutely. Sorry,
Is it still a temple of
I think
sovereignty?
so, yeah. I mean, it's out of date and everything, but so is the UN. So that,
Is it?
well, I think, you know, I don't want to sort of, I think you ought to be talking a bit, Alvaro, instead of me, but still, I mean, you're the one. But it does seem, I mean, everyone's always talking about reforming the UN. They've never stopped talking about it, actually, since about the third year of its existence. And their idea really is sort of tinkering with the Secretariat mostly. Well, every now and then you get a slight change. You change the numbers of members of the Security Council or something like that. But they have never tackled 2 or 3 absolutely major problems. And the reason, I think, is because governments still take the UN as a kind of useful last resort, a place where you can actually get a lot of things done. Some countries get quite a lot of aid out of it. And it's a very good place to go to if you're up the creek without a paddle, even if you're a great power. I mean, it's a nice place. You don't, instead of going to war, you can come and bore the pants off everybody in the Security Council. That's fine. I'm all for that. But if you really want to have an organization which has some kind of, I don't mean exactly positive, I mean positive active quality. That is to say that it tries with all of the support you want from the governments to get in front of problems and really try to solve them. Or try to keep, like we're trying to do with climate change, try desperately to keep abreast of a problem even, which is second best. Then it has to be quite different. And one of the first things that has to be done is we have to have a public discussion about the state of the world, what we're up against, and why we're still on, in the UN, though practically nowhere else, on the Westphalian, the Treaty of Westphalia from, when is it, 1648, which after all defined national sovereignty and according to a lot of people is the source of all the legal trouble. Anyhow, you have got to try to, and I don't think it's any good constantly pushing that under the rug. I mean, I used to write a lot of the Secretary General's speeches, and I always slipped in a paragraph about this, and it always got taken out because somebody would always discover it was in there. So they say, no, it'd be very embarrassing. Embarrassing my foot. I mean, this is the problem. And it's the reason, incidentally, why you can't do anything, as far as I can see, even remotely effective about climate change. It's extremely difficult to tackle a lot of humanitarian problems because of this. I mean, you get excluded from Thailand during a disaster. You can't do anything about Zimbabwe. We're left just making rhetorical remarks about Darfur. And there are lots of other smaller, less obvious cases. And the reason is that the notion of national sovereignty, I think, is now stronger, certainly, than it was in 1945. I mean, just tell John Bolton about national sovereignty. I mean, his moustache catches fire. It's really, it is an absolutely non-discussable subject. Now, why, since it's the main, the first main reason why the UN doesn't work very well and very often can't do things it ought to be able to do, you know, I think it has to be discussed, and as long as it's not discussed, we're going to have the usual problem. We're going to have Copenhagen and Darfur and a host of other subjects where here you have an international community supposedly with very good intentions, and it can't do a thing. I think to go along with that, and I dare say this is out of order, but never mind, you have got to stop people playing games with important parts of the Security Council, of the United Nations. And the first of those is the selection of the Secretary General. I mean, if you look at what, I'm sure Columbia, I looked it up, Harvard spends something like $9 million in a search thing for its next president. And I dare say everybody else does too. You know, they really try to get the best possible person for the job, man or woman. There's absolutely nothing like that in the UN. I mean, the most astonishing things happen. They don't interview the candidates. They don't ask them questions. Some of them don't even know them by sight. I vividly remember the election of the first Secretary General, actually, because there was a very nice man called Ed Stettinius, who was the head of U.S. Steel, who became, for reasons unknown to me, the Secretary of State. And he was a man who had exceptionally white teeth and white hair, I remember that, and a terrific public relations grin. I mean, and when they were voting in the Assembly on the first Secretary General, all of us did about 8 different jobs in those days, and one of my jobs was the speakers list in the Assembly. And I had a little table and would laboriously try to keep it straight. And Mr. Tinius came up and said, could you point Mr. Lai out to me? I said, what? He said, yeah, Trygve Lai, you know this guy, I think he's going to be Secretary General. Oh, I said, Mr. Lee, yes, absolutely. He's that very fat guy in a bright blue suit over there. Oh, well, thank you very much. And he padded off up to the speaker's desk and made a terrific sort of encomium of Lee, a name known to all, great figure. Went on for about 5 minutes. I had been rather naive about everything up there, and I suddenly thought, oh my God, you know, this is the way it's going to go. And it still goes on like that. They play around. They don't have any serious effort to find. There must be all over the world, in almost every country, there must be someone coming along, preferably between the age of, say, 40 and 60. And even younger than that would be nice, but I don't think the diplomats will put up with it. But who could actually is a leader, is a charismatic person who is also highly intelligent, and who could really do a job. They don't look for it at all. What they're worried about is whether the Chinese will veto it. Well, that's not a terrific qualification, really, if you come to think of it. And I spent quite several years of my retirement with the late Erskine Childers trying to persuade people that this really wasn't quite good enough. I mean, you don't find Goldman Sachs just picking up anybody at all because somebody at the top of it likes them. I mean, that's hopeless. But why do we do it in the UN? This is a very responsible job, and when things are really bad, it's a very important job. Alvaro's, the last Secretary General I worked with, Perez de Cuellar, was an extremely quiet man, and he was, I must say, one of the very few people I've ever met in public life who really, I don't think, had any ego. He simply hated the idea of being a celebrity, and took really fairly active sort of measures to avoid it, I think. I think if you look back on him, he was a very good Secretary General. He was there at a very crucial time, the turnover from the Cold War to something else. There were a lot of big crises at that time, including wars like the Iran-Iraq War, one of the worst wars of the century. And he was quiet, he was respected, his authority was respected, and that's one way of doing it. I think that they should have, for example, on a conference like Copenhagen, there should have been the Secretary General or his deputy going after the preparations for that conference and talking to everybody for months before it happened, to try to avoid the kind of, well, really pathetic, I mean, this isn't exactly, you know, what suit you're going to wear tomorrow. This is the future. It isn't a problem that you can really possibly say is not important. I think there should have been a much greater intellectual effort to try to get something which would have more or less moved in the right direction. And I think they could have done it, but they didn't. And that's why I think that you can't reform the Secretariat if you don't have a very good Secretary General either, because if the Secretary General isn't looking out, all sorts of weird people creep in just when nobody's looking. And that doesn't help either. I think it's no question that the Secretariat's got much too big, but then all bureaucracies do. They naturally grow. All of these things have to be done by this person. And to have to have a completely political sort of round game about it is not good enough. Having said that, I can tell you that absolutely nobody seems to give a damn, so what are we going to do?
Brian, there was certainly the fifth Secretary General, Mr. Pérez de Cuellar, with whom you and I both worked and whom you referred to earlier, said in a speech at Oxford in 1986, you were involved in the preparation of that speech together with me and others, and one of the things that he said was that no one should ever be a candidate for this position, meaning
that's right.
The Secretary Generalship. That was clearly along the lines that you were talking about. So as everyone knows, the Security Council these days, at least in the last 10 or 15 years, simply awaits candidatures to be put forward.
This was this is a very important point because originally nobody campaigned for it. In fact, Hammarskjöld, they made the decision on him on April the 1st. And somebody rang him up, the AP correspondent, Frank Carpenter from the UN, who was a terrific guy for he had some special private line to one of the permanent members of the council. He always knew secret decisions in advance. And he rang him up and said, at about 10 o'clock in the evening in Stockholm, and said, how do you feel about being the new Secretary General? And Hammarskjöld said, tomorrow's April Fool's Day, and you're an hour too early. He had never heard of it. I mean, it's absolutely true. He had never heard of it. There was what was the name of that Finn who was very active and tried to become Secretary General? I've forgotten his name. But
Max
he was the person
Eliasson.
who started what? Jacobson it was called.
Max Jacobson. Yes.
He was a splendid chap, but he started this business of campaigning, and I think it was a very, very, very...
He started it.
Max Jacobson. He was campaigning for a whole year. He was the first person who went all around the world and talked to people and possibly dropped off little bits of whatever it was. I mean, I think this happens. I mean, we mustn't say so, of course, but...
But he certainly wasn't the last. He wasn't the last, though.
No, absolutely no. It's now become absolutely standard. People campaign, and what that does is to close off any possibility that you're going to find somebody outside the rather sweaty world of diplomacy. I mean, the idea that you could get someone from the private sector or academia who would be wonderful is completely done in by this, because what you have is a lot of people putting themselves forward, and the Security Council, which is not a very imaginative body politically, to put it mildly, loves that. They get a sort of list, and they know, and the Americans will never stand for this, Chinese. That's what they spend their time doing. They don't say, are we getting someone who can take this organization from its rather humdrum current situation and turn it into a really number one organization on a relatively small number of problems. Obviously, peace and security is one. And then the real global problems that actually are going to one day determine whether our great-grandchildren have a decent shot at it or not, I think. I mean, I don't think this is not rhetoric. It seems to be pretty clear. I mean, whether it's a nuclear disaster or whether it's climate change and vast displacement of people and huge conflicts as a result, or whatever it is. I mean, one just wonders which conflict will finally prove to people that the Westphalian system is out of date, by which time, of course, it will be too late because the disaster will have happened. I mean, we took World War I and II to get as far as we've got now, and they were pretty disastrous, both of them. So what will it take to get us over the hump on so-called global problems? Because it is true that if you have a central leader who is elected by everybody or with the approval of everybody and has maintained their respect, when you get to some very difficult and messy situation, they really can have an enormous effect. I think that Javier was very good in this way, but quite, I mean, somebody once said we could fall out of a boat without making a splash, but that's perhaps a little unkind. I mean, his method was extreme confidence and quiet activity. And that probably is what most governments prefer, because they think otherwise they're being bossed around. But you could look for that. Perhaps one of you would like to run, I don't know, in 20, 30 years. I mean, there are, but the world is full of exceptionally able men and women, and no question of it. We somehow don't manage to look for them in the UN, and I think this is a tragedy.
Now, that person, whoever's Secretary General, at least Pérez de Cuellar felt rather strongly, still feels rather strongly on the subject.
Who's that?
That Mr. Pérez de Cuellar still feels very strongly on the subject
of
the Secretary General being independent under, as Article 100
right.
stipulates that states should respect that.
Well, I was just reading a book by the Heritage Foundation on all this kind of thing. And they really, I mean, it is extraordinary because it is in the Charter about independence. There's an article which also asks the members, please not to try to violate the independence of the Secretary General and the Secretariat, because they are loyal, they are working for the organization as a whole, not for one set of interests. But this seems to have been forgotten. I mean, the bulk of the criticisms from the Heritage Foundation is that the Secretariat simply does not knuckle under to the United States, and therefore it's illegal. Well, it's the other way around. And I do think that this is something that's managed to somehow get lost. I'm not saying the Secretariat is perfect. It is not. And it needs a great deal of work.
Article 100, paragraph 2 of the Charter is not frequently invoked enough.
Virtually never.
Yes.
I mean, it's absolutely clear. There's no question about it.
But let me ask you about Article 99. Article 99 is important, it seems to me, not simply because it allows the Secretary General to bring matters to the attention of the Security Council, most of which are on the Security Council's agenda in one way or another in any way, but rather because it presupposes that the Secretary General has the capacity to make the judgment about the gravity of the situation and the need to do something about it. Is it not a sort of a rather clamorous situation that the Secretary General really does not have the ability to make that kind of judgment on an educated and independent basis?
Well, I mean, you're absolutely right. This is if you look in the Charter, virtually the only basis for independent political or mediating action is Article 99, under which he has the right to bring to the attention of the Security Council a situation which in his opinion is a threat to peace. I mean, it's a pretty narrow bridge if you come to think of it, but you can actually extrapolate from that of course if he wasn't actually following things, he wouldn't be able to make a proper decision. It was not used, I think I'm right in saying, until 1960, Article 99, and Hammarskjöld used it to call the Security Council about the crisis in the Congo. But I think the trouble with it is that you have to do a lot of preparation. You've got to be perfectly clear that you've got support for your action before you go into the council and call them in and say you've got to do something about X. It's no good if one or other of the permanent members, or indeed a majority of the council, gets up and says, absolutely not, that's pure nonsense, stop it. That's hopeless. And I think that there was no question in 1960 in the Congo, everybody was, for different reasons, extremely worried by the total breakdown in, by far the richest, I think, and the second largest country in Africa. I mean, it really was that included the Soviet Union, because they did not want to get into a confrontation with the United States over Africa. They were very anxious not to do it. Of course, that didn't mean that they didn't have a 600-man embassy all waiting to go in Leopoldville after independence, but Anyhow, they were nervous, and in fact, they were very helpful. They flew in a lot of the original UN troops.
Which
I
were
don't,
rather
I
critical.
don't, I don't, who else has used it? I'm sure people have, but I can't think who they are. It's been used a number of times.
But I think
What?
less than a handful of times.
Yeah, really. I can't remember.
As I recall, perhaps someone in the audience could refresh us, but I don't believe that it's been more than 5 times altogether.
No, I think it's really. But as I say, it's no good. This is not a rhetorical device. It's no good coming in with a request under that article and finding that you're going to be shot down by all the governments concerned. You can't do it.
But, for instance, you said that one shouldn't rule out the possibility, or you even encourage the possibility of having some major corporate leader as a possible Secretary General. But of course, a corporate leader, the first thing he'll do is look at the mission statement and look at Article 99. He says, okay, well, what are the means of which I dispose? I mean, the UN doesn't have embassies, it doesn't have an intelligence services or an army. How am I supposed to make that judgment?
Well, I don't think. I think this would not be a good. I think that the deputy ought to be the CEO. There is a deputy secretary general. I must say, you never know it, but there is one, and Paul Volcker suggested this in this 6-volume report on oil for food, which incidentally is that there's the source for 30 musicals and 80 novels in that book. It's well worth reading. I think I'm the only person who's read it. Certainly no one in the Secretary General's office has read it, I can tell you that. But he said, you know, it's ridiculous to suppose that you can suddenly amount a $64 million program overnight and not have somebody who is actually in charge of it. You know, you have the Secretary General who hasn't got time anyway. You have a perfectly nice deputy in those days who actually was busy doing something else. And that's a lot of money, I mean, it seems to me. Why the UN sometimes is amazingly primitive, and this is one of the reasons. I don't know why they couldn't. But then, of course, if you call it a chief executive officer, you will have a huge problem in the General Assembly, particularly with what used to be called the non-aligned countries. I don't know what they're called now, developing countries. They don't like the idea of the Secretary General getting more authority on this kind of thing. They think it's a bad idea. But you know, if you don't do that, I always thought, I must say, to digress slightly, it always seemed to me that the oil for food scandal was one of the biggest boondoggles in the media, and not to mention the United States Congress, of anything. If you look carefully, the corruption in terms of money was $145,086, which was supposedly the sum given to the guy who was running it now.
Benon Sevan.
What's that? Benon Sevan, who was a Cypriot. By some oil company, which is, I mean, it's a standard thing you do apparently in the oil trade. I mean, people get paid for services rendered. And this guy had signed in a small oil company onto the list of people who were dealing direct with the Iraqi government. That's not really a terrific piece of corruption. I mean, it may be very inefficient. But after all, it wasn't the Secretary General who arranged that the people providing the goods and services, to the tune of whatever it was, 64 billion, would deal direct with the Iraqi government. It wasn't the idea of the Secretary General, it was the good old Security Council, on which, as we all know, the United States and the British and everybody had a veto, so that there wasn't any way they couldn't have stopped it. The only trouble with that was, of course, that the Iraqi government would not have gone along at all without it. So I think it was this, I think that this huge, what was the disputed sum in the savings and loan scandal in 1986? It was 500 and something billion. You know, and yet you had the New York Times saying this is the biggest financial scandal ever. Well, I mean, it may be, but tell that to the poor Iraqis who were being supported under heavy sanctions all this time by this program. It's what allowed them to have a semblance of a life. Anyhow, I digress.
Should the UN have turned down that,
No.
that mission?
No, I think that they should have insisted that if. I mean, I think there were a lot of people in the Iraqi government. It's their last chance to be on the take, so that it was nice, good for them. And of course, if you were doing good business, oil companies aren't necessarily supposed to be Boy Scouts, are they? I don't know. I mean, I think when you mix these cultures up, and then you have a Secretary General, in that case Kofi Annan, who Washington is furious with for other reasons, then you get a problem. I think this was there were about 3 newspapers in the whole country who actually tried to describe what actually happened. And it was not good, but it wasn't. It was not the greatest scandal in history or anything like that. Not by a long chalk. And it did actually work up to a point fairly well, considering what a different. And incidentally, a lot of the, as I understand it, I retired 26 years ago, so that I have no idea what I'm talking about. But I've been told that there was a whole sort of sector of Iraqis who were the distributors and the people on the ground. And on the whole, they did extremely well, and they're the people now who are really helping in the sort of reconstruction and so on. Do you think that's true? I don't see who else can. I don't see why that wouldn't be true. I
wouldn't know about the subject, but that sort of brings me, at least me, to the subject of sanctions of that kind, otherwise known as crippling sanctions. What do you think about the notion of sanctions, looking back?
Well, you know, sanctions were considered quite seriously to be the alternative to war all through the 20s. The only trouble was that nobody ever imposed them. As far as I know, nobody put sanctions on Mussolini when he invaded Abyssinia, for example, or Ethiopia as it now is. Though every do-gooder in sight, when I was a boy, was yelling that they should do it, and I think they should have done it. Why not? We invaded another country, sanctioned. So they've never really very much been tried. Isn't it true that they've refined sanctions a great deal, so that now they've tried to target them in such a way that it doesn't actually cause terrible suffering to the population at large, and actually targets ministers who want to go to Las Vegas or something like that, or indeed have a lot of money stashed away in Switzerland? Yes. I think so. Does that work?
There seems to have been a turning point, a turning point when Madeleine Albright, I believe she was already Secretary of State at that time, who said that sanctions are actually a blunt instrument, and that therefore they can have sometimes consequences that are not the desired ones, and that the whole notion of punishing the people in the expectation that they will rise up against a dictator is somehow slightly flawed. And then they have moved to targeting them. I think that the key moment there was after a mission to Angola, during which they realized that the way to do it was to somehow put a corner on the diamond market, and if you could just do that could have some sort of effect. But the original notion in the Charter, where they're not referred to as sanctions, as I understand it, the spirit of the relevant articles in the Charter is that the purpose of such measures is to modify behavior rather than to punish, as seems to be frequently the case.
Well, you could say, I suppose, that sanctions on South Africa did have, I have no idea whether this is true or not.
It took a long time, but yes.
But it took a long time, but I think it did very much affect the business community, and so they became fairly anti-apartheid, and without them it would have been very difficult to do anything. Is that true or not? I've always thought it was.
I think so.
But I don't know. I mean, who thinks that should everybody take part in this? Because I seem to be talking
if
for
you are
hours,
willing.
There's nothing more.
If you are
helpful
willing.
than that.
Yes.
But
There's actually someone standing in the margin with a live microphone.
How would people say that if they get through the Security Council, the latest volume of a series of stringent sanctions would affect Iran? It seems to me this is a very tricky situation to get into. I mean, but I don't know. Somebody here must have studied that. I haven't.
Or perhaps they have other concerns.
What?
Would anyone like to ask a question or two? Yes.
Yes.
You have mentioned that the governments.
Oh, wait. There's a microphone headed for in
sorry.
another direction just now. They'll come back to you.
Yes, Sir Brian. I wanted to ask what your feelings are about the Security Council these days, and whether you are in favor of expanding it or changing it in any way from what it is now.
Hi, Steve. Oh, Lord. Well, I don't think you can. It seems to me we have a built-in and insoluble obstacle to expanding the Security Council, namely that none of the main regions can agree which is top nation, and therefore should be a permanent member. Isn't that the main problem now? I mean, you have 3 in Africa, at least 2 in Latin America, and I don't know what in Asia, so that it's almost, I wonder really, I mean, it does seem to me that it is another sort of virtually antique, a part of the antique character of the UN, that you have the main body of the UN actually represents rather imperfectly the power balance in the world in 1945, and here we are in 2010. It doesn't really make a lot of sense. And I don't know, do you think they'll ever solve it?
No, I don't.
I don't think so either. I mean, everybody gets very annoyed when anybody else puts up a plan, but that's not really the same thing as progress, is it? I don't know. Meanwhile, the thing goes on, but I think it is. It's an Achilles heel to the organization. I'm sorry, this gentleman here.
You have mentioned very correctly, even after reading the charter, that the governments don't like to give much authority to the Secretary General. You have been very close to the second Secretary General, and you must be knowing very much closely about his character and about his techniques. What was the most important factor which instigated Dag Hammarskjöld to carry most of the government with him and with his program, and they had so much confidence in his initiatives?
Well, that's how much time have you got? I mean, I'm a terrific bore on this subject, I warn you, but nonetheless, I will try to keep it short. Hammarskjöld was a very unusual person. He had virtually no small talk. I mean, it wasn't really a sort of blast to spending a lot of time with Hammarskjöld because he was so serious. And furthermore, he was reserving his energy for more important things. I was very pleased with myself. I was one of the people who ran the first international conference on the peaceful uses of atomic energy. It was an enormous conclave of scientists in 1955. And it was the first occasion when both the United States and the Soviet Union and a lot of other countries declassified enormous quantities of nuclear information. So it was extremely important. And I wrote a kind of a short account of this conference. And it was Hammarskjöld's priority for that particular year. He loved it because he liked intellectuals, and after all, most of the physicists were intellectuals, and so they had a grand old time. It was fine. And he was very pleased with it. And I sent him this note, which I took a great deal of trouble over, about 25 pages, trying to describe it. And I got it back instantly with the following inscription. I still have it. Thanks, but no time. Well, this was Hammarskjöld. He was absolutely concentrated on the task. And he was a bachelor. He didn't have any domestic problems that I know of. And he he was an intellectual in action, which is a very nice combination. I think he was also a very, he made a huge impression on people, and I've never been able to account for that. I mean, you could go to Rio de Janeiro or New Delhi or Tokyo, the taxi driver would know who Hammarskjöld was and would have a curiously accurate but simplified idea of what he was trying to do. Now that is something for somebody who was a very bad speaker, who had no small talk, ostensibly very little charisma. How did he do this? I mean, what do the Swedes know that we don't know? That's what I've always wondered. I mean, it was extraordinary. And on top of that, he was a practical intellectual. I mean, his capacity for thinking up alternatives which would actually be even better than what they were discussing already, and seeing round corners to where something would either move forward or get stuck. He was incredibly good at this. He could, I think he could do something which I certainly can't do, and I don't know how many of you can, which is to sit by himself and think about a very complicated problem. Let's say the American airmen in China or something like that. And after about an hour, come out with an absolutely coherent plan with alternatives for talks in China, a country he'd never been to and didn't know. I mean, that's the sort of person. He was very unusual. But why this got through to large numbers of people, I do not know. I mean, that is very strange. And as I say, of course, his trouble was that he was a bit too good for the permanent members of the Security Council. One of the reasons why they seem to be extremely anxious to avoid having an intellectual again in that job is Hammarskjöld, because he started off telling the United States they shouldn't have overturned the government in Guatemala in 1954.
Yeah.
I think that was a very good piece of advice it turned out, but nonetheless it didn't go down well. And then the United States, greatly to his credit, and that was Henry Cabot Lodge, I think, realized after the Chinese American prisoners that you couldn't expect Hammarskjöld always to agree with the United States, but actually he was infinitely valuable nonetheless, because if you were really in a jam, he could be of great help. I mean, and people did respect him for that. Even Khrushchev, who got into this really manic state and started banging shoes and things, even he, when Hammarskjöld died, said Hammarskjöld was a very great man, I have to admit it. And that was, of course, the reason why he was mad with him. The only person who never became accustomed to Hammarskjöld was Charles de Gaulle, who thought he was some kind of uppity fellow trying to get into this sacred group of great power heads of state. And that was not a relationship made in heaven, I must say. In fact, the general did his level best to sabotage Hammarskjöld whenever he could. But I think it was the mixture of intellect, an enormous. He was, I suppose, very religious in a very weird kind of mystical way, and he read books on mysticism as if they were novels. I mean, he was a. I think this was a huge part of it. I think that he just was a very unusual character. And I don't suppose we shall find anyone like that again, but that's not the only way to do it. I mean, the whole point about that job is you have to get somebody really good who will decide how to do it best in their own way. I mean, it's like Javier, who decided that he was not going to be known by every taxi driver in the world and so on, and didn't have a chance to. Anyhow, it was his style. I think you can, once you get the intellectual and the sort of moral, ethical quality, after that, you've just got to look for somebody who has the stamina to do it.
And it's hard to do that unless there is some sort of a systematic search process.
We don't consult, the Security Council doesn't consult anybody in academia about this. They don't go out and consult great corporate organizations. I mean, there are a lot of very intelligent people in the corporate world. That's why they make so much money. I mean, would have a lot of good advice to offer. We don't do it. We look about a very, very limited circle in a sort of old boy net. We've never had a woman Secretary General now. Can you believe it? After 65 years, it's outrageous. It's really terrible.
Yes, question here.
Thank you so much for everything thus far. It's been absolutely fascinating. I'm taking a course with Jean-Marie Guénaud, mostly on peacekeeping, but one of my favorite phrases of his that he's repeated over and over again is that the strength of the UN is its weakness. And I was hoping you could comment on that.
That sounds like one of the questions in Turandot, doesn't it? The strength of the UN is its weakness.
Lies in its weakness.
Well, the weakness of the UN is strong. Are you quite sure there isn't another phrase in there somewhere? I have a huge admiration for Jean-Marie, incidentally. I mean, he's a wonderful fellow. So if he says it, any ideas? I think there's something missing.
At least my understanding of what he means by that is that there's no sort of underlying agenda, or that there's more of a perception of neutrality, maybe, that the UN can use to its advantage. I believe that's what he means by that.
Well, I think this thing about neutrality actually has tended to get rather confused. I think objectivity is a better word. Because after all, there are some situations in which both civilians and the military do have to take decisions and actually do something which a hell of a lot of other people don't like. With a bit of luck, they will prove to be right in the end. But you know, I'm not sure about neutrality. I think it's a state which applies to particular states who have neutrality in their constitution, and it's very well. But I don't think the UN is that. I think it should be impartial and objective. And intelligent, incidentally, which is not always quite the case. Those are the three things it had to be. And neutrality, well, I mean, neutrality for what? I think it should not. I think one of the great things, but that's very difficult now too, with dealing with internal situations in Yugoslavia or any number of places the UN is in now, is you have to try to not become the advocate of one party. You cannot do that, particularly in states that are trying to be democratic. But I'm puzzled. I think I shall have to call him up and ask him.
Especially if it keeps coming back. There's a question here on the first row.
Sir Brian, if I can bring you back to the Palestinian-Israeli conflict.
I said what?
To the Palestinian-Israeli conflict.
Yeah.
I think it's an issue that the UN has invested huge amounts of efforts, both in a way in creating the conflict with the partition plan of 1947, and also positively, for example, with the contribution that UNRWA, as an example, has made to the Palestinian nationalist movement in creating an educated class. What do you think has been the impact of the conflict, particularly the genesis in its beginnings in the UN, and the obsession, and ultimately the failure?
Well, I'm not sure you can speak of either success or failure in that conflict. I mean, it seems to me that you have to take in very small stages, otherwise. But that, of course, is a recipe for not solving it. And whether it's not soluble at all, I'm not so sure. Well, Alvaro knows a great deal more about this than I do. I always thought that, well, partition in the first place is a terrible idea, it seems to me. I mean, how many partitions do we have that we know are a disaster? There's India and Pakistan, which was the Indian subcontinent, which created a huge casualty list, and really not a very satisfactory situation for either of them up to now. Ireland, not very good. Cyprus. You know, I think that I don't know why the partition plan had been around since before the war, actually, before World War II. And Bunch and Bernadotte put it into the final recommendation because they simply couldn't think of any other way that you could even attempt to stop what was beginning to be an almost permanent state of war in the summer of 1948 after Israel became a state. And it had been very, very violent before that. And I think they just felt that you had to do this. I don't know whether that was an irresponsible thing, but it was about the only thing that you could get both sides, well, not you could get the Arab states to agree on it. One of the great problems at the beginning was the Palestinians were not represented as Palestinians. They were represented by a group of Arab states headed by Egypt. And this certainly didn't help the Palestinians at all. And it made their position, I think, very weak at a time. UNRWA, I think, was just a necessity. I mean, if you have, whatever it was, 450,000 refugees in the first go, and even more after 1967, you have to have somebody to look after them. And I must say that I think the whole thing of vocational training and producing from the camps a whole class of people who really were very, very valuable in the whole area. I mean, people who did a huge amount of work, for example, in places like the Gulf and so on, who were very important. Given all the other suffering the Palestinians have had to undergo, this at least was something. And after all now, if the New York Times is right, you know, if it wasn't for UNRWA, people in Gaza would be 50 times worse off than they are already. So I think that one has to, it's just a pity that you had to prolong a huge, what essentially was a refugee organization to begin with, over a period of, 60 years now?
60.
So that the other thing was, really the solution seems to me to have very little to do with reason or common sense, if there ever is one. It takes a lot of heavy boosting from outside to get any agreement on this at all. Gunnar Jarring, who was the Swedish UN representative after 1967 for 3 or 4 years, I think got as near as possible to producing some, not perhaps a final solution, but at least a very large step towards it, with the whole concept of
Land for peace.
what?
Land for peace.
Yes, land for peace. But Jarring he didn't have any clout. He had no military clout, he had no economic clout, he had no financial clout. He was just one jolly old Swede, and a very good one too. He was terrific. But there was simply no way. I mean, I imagine George, though now of course the thing is infinitely worse than it was then, but I imagine George Mitchell, if he ever gets anywhere near to some kind of successful solution, does have a lot of useful power and clout to push things along. And I think that's certainly true. I think that at the moment the really terrible problem is that the Palestinians themselves are not united. You have a complete sort of schism between Hamas, Hezbollah, and Abbas, the Fatah, and this really puts them in an impossible position too, because it's very easy for the Israelis to say that they can't deal with a movement which is divided in two, at least.
And it's stuck at the Security Council completely.
Well, I think the Security, yeah. I mean, I don't think the Security Council. Alvaro, you should talk about this because you are far more recently engaged with this than I am. Come on.
No, I mean, clearly there is a problem. I can't imagine that it is not understood by the powers that be that the only way to have a viable agreement between Israel and the Palestinians is if the Palestinians are reunified and speaking more or less as one. But at the same time, that is not acceptable to many, because one of the two Palestinian wings or sides, Hamas, doesn't meet certain conditions which on their face they can't possibly meet. I mean, for Hamas, the idea of recognition of Israel whilst under occupation by Israel is simply a non-starter, because it's a form of legitimization of the occupation. So if some way can't be found around that, it's not possible to produce a viable agreement. By viable, meaning an agreement that the Palestinians broadly will accept and live with and tolerate.
Of course, the other thing is there is a very considerable question, I supposing there was agreement, whether the state of affairs in the West Bank is susceptible to becoming a Palestinian state. And I mean, this is all very much changed.
Yes, everyone seems to assume that the outcome of the solution, that the parameters are well known and accepted by everybody, and they talk about somehow combining the Clinton parameters of early 2000 and the Geneva Initiative 2002. But of course, they do not provide for a viable Palestinian state. They do not establish connectivity between Gaza and the West Bank. They do not give the Palestinians control over their airspace or their subsoil. I mean, there are a number of the attributes of sovereignty which aren't really there. I'm not sure whether the solution is there, but on the other hand, even for that, it doesn't seem possible within the existing Israeli political system to produce a solution that the Israelis can accept.
Yeah.
You know, you have any Israeli leader is faced with a dilemma of, well, can I reach an agreement with the Palestinians, or in order to reach an agreement with the Palestinians that will work, I would have to give up my coalition. I mean, one of the first person I interviewed here was Shlomo Ben-Ami, who spoke about how when they came to Camp David and afterward to Taba, I believe it was, for these negotiations, by the time they got to Camp David, they had lost one of their coalition partners, and by the time they got back to Israel, it was just Barak and Barak and Shlomo. I believe it's more or less those were his words. You just can't put get it through. There are members of the Israeli coalition who have as their main agenda that there should not be any negotiation regarding Jerusalem, for instance. But I'm going on, and this is about getting your views, Brian.
Any other
questions?
So, Brian, when listening to your account of Cold War history and the role of the UN in it, you might get the impression that the UN was actually very much at the center, working with the key countries at the time, really being a mediator, being a respected organization. When you read the press nowadays, you might get a slightly different impression. There are lots of articles and discussions about the marginalization of the UN. Regional organizations are taking over. The G20 is getting more and more important. So my question is, and of course, and also the emergence of China, we're getting a much more difficult world. There's not one country that really sets the international agenda anymore and can dominate. So my question is, where do you see the UN heading? I mean, is the UN becoming irrelevant? Or where do you see the UN in the coming decades? Where are the opportunities for action? Thank you.
Yeah, well, I think, people always look back and see the past through rather rosy spectacles. I mean, it seemed to me we were overcome by tremendous blasts of abuse, especially all the time, whatever we did. But now everybody says it was all so wonderful and everything. I think there are two things which, in the first place, the UN does a huge amount of stuff which nobody's ever heard of, which I think would be seriously missed if it didn't happen. And it's not very exciting. I mean, statistics, okay. It's very important. There are a lot of the whole thing of the development of international law. It's very important. It isn't. It's not a. It doesn't keep you awake at night. But there it is. So that's one thing. As to its whole central object has kept changing. We were originally put up to stop World War II from happening again, as I mentioned at the beginning, with aggression, economic disasters, and getting rid of the imperial world. That was quite a success. I mean, decolonization, I think, was an absolutely historical development of extraordinary importance, which is what's given us the world we have now, which is, in many ways, much more difficult to run. But it's the right thing to have done, and that's it. I'm never quite sure about globalization, because I don't really understand about it, but it does seem to me that if globalization has happened, it hasn't been much of a success, except for a very small number of people. It really has not been very helpful to the developing world. It's produced a lot of problems which wouldn't have been there before. There are now at least 4 or 5 areas which could be nearly terminal for organized life on this planet. Now, everybody's always talked about that, but it's never been quite like this. There's never been anything quite like pandemics which are produced by huge amounts of air travel and so on. I mean, where you get something that starts in a village in Mexico can turn out to be a disaster in China. I mean, this is new. Nobody has ever had the array of weapons of mass destruction which now exist in the world, not just nuclear either. There are now quite a lot of movements to say that all government is wrong and corrupt, and international governance is even worse. I mean, I don't think there are sort of international Tea Party parties yet, but except unless you could call Al Qaeda one. I mean, it does seem to me their objective is to do in governmental order around the world and reestablish the caliphate. Well, that's fine. But the only trouble is what's going to happen to all of us. It's not going to be, and we know that they have a very brutal notion of doing it. It'll be 50,000 times worse if any of those get even the simplest of weapons of mass destruction. I'm thinking of chemical or biological weapons, let alone serious nuclear bombs. There's climate change. Well, it does seem to me that this sudden eruption of people saying that it's not really happening is painful and absurd. This really is an ostrich act of unbelievable silliness. And sooner or later, I mean, the Maldives Islands, I believe I'm right in saying, are buying territory on the mainland already because they're just simply not going to be there. Not to mention the poor old polar bears and everything. This is going to affect almost everybody. And we've been told by very reputable scientists, not necessarily the whole UN group, but Hansen and all these people, who Russians, after all, spend their lives studying this. That we're almost reaching a point of no return. But every time anybody gets up steam about something, we get some huge distraction. I think that the function of the UN should be to maintain a level discussion of matters which are extremely important, which governments really can't handle. And governments are going to have to somehow be persuaded that complete national sovereignty is fine, but it really is pretty irrelevant when you have world destruction in mind. I mean, a nuclear exchange of any greatness would be unbelievably destructive, and I can imagine that the biological weapons might be much, much worse in the long run. Anyhow, we have the capacity, due to our huge technological revolution, to have all these things go wrong. But to make that stick, you have to have very impressive people running it, you have to have people who governments will take absolutely seriously, and you have to have people who are capable of communicating so that the public is able to make decisions. At the moment, as far as I can make out, I don't know whether it's true that virtually the whole public now gets its news from cable television, but if so, God help us all. You know, you've got to somehow get the public interested in their own survival. And I think that again is something that the UN has recently failed to do. You've got to try to get back to a notion of international politics and international affairs which is intimately connected with the public. And I mean, it is very noticeable, at least I've always found it very noticeable. If you go to the Scandinavia, the Nordic countries, all of which have, over the years, sent a great number of young people to peacekeeping operations. Almost anyone you talk to has a far better idea of what the UN is about than somebody in the most people in the United States. The United States has not had large numbers of young people at an impressionable age involved, let's say, in Cyprus or the Congo or some other ghastly place. You know, this is very important education. You've got to somehow or other get into the heads of people that it isn't all a sort of media game, this. And you've got to get into the heads of governments that some of the things that, if you're going to pay large sums of, well, not very large sums of money, but fairly large sums of money for the UN year in, year out, you might as well get your money's worth, in which case you need to staff it properly. You really have to, I mean, I'm astonished at the, I mean, they all say, well, no, this is really a political matter. Don't worry a little head about running the organization. That's going to be the good old Chinese and the United States and the Russians and everybody hacking it out at midnight and just asking each other who they won't veto. I mean, that's what it amounts to. This is no sense. But I don't know. This is not a view that it's very easy to get across, because most people, I think, are finally bored with the UN. You know, it is a talking shop. Why not? But and you've got to really try to emphasize the priority things that organization ought to do. I personally have always thought, for example, that it ought to be much more effective in peacekeeping, which means having a permanent establishment, and a permanent establishment which is genuinely international, so that you can't pin on any unit of a UN peacekeeping force that it's nothing but Pakistanis or it's nothing but Finns or something like that. That's wrong. You have to, but this is a step which is now so far away that I don't think we'll ever get to it. I mean, it used to be that a lot of governments were interested in that. Nobody's interested in that because peacekeeping works all right, it sort of muddles along, and all right, so 5 million people got killed in the eastern Congo in the last 6 years, but you know, that's the way it is. This is terrible. And I just feel that the government assessment of the UN is that there it is, you know, we pay for it, and every now and then it's incredibly useful, and quite a lot of the time it isn't. And therefore you have it kind of gradually falling to bits. As I said, what puzzles me is which of the potential cosmic catastrophes is going to persuade governments and people around the world that the Treaty of Westphalia is not enough. I mean, that the principle of national sovereign states is over. And it's over in virtually all fields except diplomacy now. So there we are.
We have another question. If you can. There.
Thank you. I wanted to ask you about your view on UN reform, as a sort of never-ending story in the UN, and in particular reform of the UN Secretariat. What do you see as the key priorities in order to reform the UN Secretariat as an institution to meet global challenges of today?
You know, any answer I give to that is going to be extremely self-serving, because I'm going to say something, I'll say it, but watch out. In the first place, we need to get back into the Secretariat the kind of spirit and general feeling of enthusiasm that we have. Well, Alvaro is a very good case in point. He's a surviving person like this, but quite a lot of people in the Secretariat, I think, are just clipping coupons, really, and it's easy to say that. It's incredibly difficult to change it. You are going to get huge opposition, especially from developing countries, if you start really cutting down on the Secretariat. And yet any bureaucracy gets into this state after a bit. It's been going for 65 years. So there's a big political problem right there. Certainly having a very tough and very good Secretary General and a really good, tough deputy would help. Because you've got to, the only person who's actually done this, as far as I know, is Hammarskjöld, who actually spent 18 months doing, when he was first arrived, doing absolutely nothing except wandering around the world looking at the UN in various places and deciding what was necessary and what wasn't. And then he figured out a plan that you didn't need to fire anybody very much, you just move people around, and some people were going to retire anyway, and somehow you weren't going to cause individual suffering in the Secretariat, but you get a much more workable staff out of it, and I think he did do that. I think you've got to stop governments meddling in it, which they do all the time now, with candidates. I had when I was there, I had a very useful way of avoiding that, which was to keep my office improbably small. And if any by any chance died or got shot or something, you concealed it until you filled that position immediately. Otherwise, you have from all over the world drunks, people who are hopeless, cousins of prime ministers. I mean, there's a huge pool of these people. And I'm not joking, it's perfectly true, isn't it? And you have to have a tough administration which doesn't mind telling governments no. Otherwise, and Hammarskjöld could do that. I think that, I'm not about sure about Javier. He was such a nice chap, I'm not sure, but you know you cannot run that kind of thing well.
He
If
would
in the first
evade
place,
the question.
you don't get the best people, and in the second place, you get rid of people who aren't any good. And that's what we have, after all, we have geographical representation, though it comes second in the chart at the competence. Have a little more. And then I think a lot of the activities of the UN are very old-fashioned. I don't know if you ever attended a meeting of the committees of the General Assembly, but you know they never use one word where 2,000 will do, and they go on for months. This is not a way of impressing the public. It just isn't. I think that maybe one has to think about the whole setup of world diplomacy. I mean, some of my best friends are diplomats, but you know, they sometimes make you want to kill them. They in really critical situations, you know, you just wish that the trap door would open and they. I mean, I started life as a soldier, so I need to have an unreasonable view of going and getting things done. But you know, I think this was for the 19th century, when it took 6 months to go from Madrid to London, and you know, you had people there who were really going to be there for ages, and really became part of the country they were diplomats in, and were very useful because they could give general representations. They really couldn't deal with emergencies. Now, the capacity to deal with emergencies is very ill-served in the UN. I mean, makes no sense to take 6 months to deploy a peacekeeping force in Sierra Leone or somewhere where people are dying by the thousands every week. That's nonsense. But you know, you can't get a discussion on that now. So there we are.
Brian, perhaps one last question with you, Alvaro? Because we're very close to the witching hour.
Well, I mean, I think everybody might like to get a bit of fresh.
I've been at the UN for the last 3.5 years as a journalist, and it's been very interesting because I'm seeing various things. It seems to me the serious problem that I see is that the Security Council could have done the weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, and there were no weapons of mass destruction. All those resolutions led to the US being able to get the resolution to invade, and then the UN became supported being the US being the occupier. And so that's, I think, the illegitimacy of the UN is to have this kind of activity going on And it just seems that there's no lessons from that. Instead, the same thing appears to be happening with Iran. There's a dispute. Is enrichment for peaceful purposes allowed, or is it going to lead to the ability to build a bomb in a country like Iran? And this is a dispute over the NPT, and yet it's become the Security Council again doing the same thing, and the press doing the same thing, threatening military action and invasion. So is there some way you see in your long experience of the UN, of legitimizing the UN again, having a way to not let the Security Council get out of hand the way it did with Iraq and the way
Well, I
it is
think
in others?
actually I'm the last person in the world to blow the trumpet for the Security Council, but as I recollect it, the Security Council absolutely dug its heels in and said it could not possibly support the invasion of Iraq. And in fact, George W. Bush then said that, of course, the UN would be, what was it, not obsolete, he had a wonderful word. And I mean, in fact, it was curtains. And actually, and they were right about that. I mean, and it took quite a lot of moral courage, not by the British who agreed with it, but yeah.
To do that, but then they said,
yeah, but I mean, I get your point. I mean, I do think it is true that I had thought when I first joined the UN, which was just in late 1945, that as members of the Security Council, government representatives would behave with the interests of the whole international world in mind. Well, dream on. I mean, no way. And that's the problem. That's what you're talking. They don't do it. Everybody. Sometimes people try to do it, but it's very. And I think this is one of the things that you need to have in a public discussion of where we have got politically. I mean, are we still a world of sovereign, independent, untouchable states, or are we going to become something different? Because eventually we're going to have to become something different anyway, and already in most walks of life we become different. So I mean, I think this is the big, and I think it's really the problem you're talking about. What you have going on in the Security Council it sounds like 1905 in Europe. I mean, it's a lot of people talking past each other and making compromises and so on. It's not very impressive. It's better than nothing. But I think the other thing is we desperately need sort of useful and fairly revolutionary suggestions from the outside world, and especially academia. I mean, it does seem there's we had a talk about sanctions, which I know nothing about. But the Brown University, I think it is, has a whole program on that, which actually turned out to be quite useful to the Security Council. They were projecting some ideas about how you would have more targeted sanctions, less destructive, more effective, and so on. And I think there must be hundreds of subjects like that, which a little fresh air and fresh thinking would be wonderful, and I very much hope that you'll produce that. And run for Secretary General.
Brian, thank you for bringing fresh air and fresh thinking.
Thank you. It was very nice. Very good.